Did you show the screen?
Was just on to the waiting room.
In the waiting room?
Live, but it's not showing. Oh, no, it's okay.
Okay.
We'll call this meeting to order. It is Monday, August 28th, for the City of Kingsburg regular Finance Committee meeting. We'll first open it up to public comments, if there's any person who would like to address the committee. Seeing none, we'll move over to item 3, the approval of the minutes. Motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Item 4, the City Solar Array Project for the financing update. Presentation by Public Works Director Daniel Galvez.
Chairman, committee members, here today, update the finance committee and provide some additional information on the cash flows for and financing options for the solar project. The financing portion if we decide to borrow some money to complete that project. So with that, we'll kick it off to Psychologic to just kind of provide some updates on kind of some of that cash flow and what they're proposing for that project to move forward.
Certainly. Jessica, did you want to talk a little bit first?
Sure, yes.
There.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me just fine?
Yeah, we can.
Great, okay. So wanted to draw your attention to the 3 cash flows that we've provided here. Wanted to make sure that each of the committee members can see the cash flows.
But they're also in the packet.
Yeah.
Excellent, okay. So the 3 cash flows that we provided you for your consideration today, one is the original ECA loan cash flow. This was presented to the council back in March. This is the original project here. The second cash flow, we want to scroll down, yep, is the current cash flow that is being considered. It's the tax exempt municipal lease option. And the third cash flow is the scenario in which the city would wait to apply for the ECA loan for potential funding in June of 2024 or December of 2024. So we did go back and put our heads together as an organization to see how we could reduce the financial burden to the city as a result of the tax exempt municipal lease option. So Eddie Jordan is there in person to explain what we were able to do for the city. Eddie, if you want to go ahead and take it away.
Sure. So we went back and talked to our subcontractors and vendors, and we're able to reduce the project cost, overall project cost, by about $50,000. But on top of that, we were able to absorb the first 5 years of the O&M services. That's something that we provide. We were able to eat those costs. So for a total of about $150,000 for the program, we're able to cut. Now, with those cuts, we have prices locked in for the next 2.5, 3 months. After that, we're not sure where things are going to come back from the vendors and everyone. Yeah, we were able to reduce some price to see if we can get the TML to work better for you now instead of waiting until next year for the ECA.
Thank you, Eddie.
Thank you.
So with that, do you guys have any questions regarding any of that cash flow? And if not, we can probably pass it back over to Nikki, and she can talk a little bit about if we decide to move forward in that manner of how the financing would work if we decided to move that way.
Okay. Is there any other, before we move on, is there any committee discussion so far? Okay, Nikki?
Yes, hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm Nikki Tallman. For those of you that I haven't met, I'm a managing director with Oppenheimer, and I've been in the business for 30 plus years. We had the privilege of working with the city back in 2015 on a consolidated refinancing and also on a refinancing of the city's lease revenue bonds for the fire station. And so Michael Garcia and I are going to go through the PowerPoint. I'm going to let him introduce himself here and kick us off. If you have questions, please ask along the way, and we'll try to answer as we go. Michael?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Again, I'm Michael Garcia. I'm an associate here at Oppenheimer and have been working in public finance for just over 4 years. So I'm happy to walk you guys through the presentation and help answer any questions as we go along. Okay, here's just a brief slide on what we'll cover today. One, we'll go over kind of a market update, things what's been going on over the past year or so. We'll review the financing process and options, go over a preliminary numerical analysis, and then we'll touch on what a financing schedule might look like and next steps should the council decide to move forward with this process. So here we have a market update slide. Really over the past 6 months to a year, the market has really been feeding off of any comments made by the Federal Reserve, especially with regards to economic data, and a lot of other inflation reports that keep coming in either above or below expectations. In July, the Federal Reserve had their last board meeting where they raised interest rates by 25 basis points. Right now, the Fed funds rate is at its highest level in over 20 years. So it's been a substantial increase in rates. And over the past month or so, we've seen expectations sort of change. And you can see that here in the graph. We've seen the 10 and 30-year MMD rise by over 45 basis points. So that's pretty substantial for over a month's time. Next month is the next Federal Reserve meeting. It'll be held on September 20th. So most investors, they're really anticipating, what could happen. A lot of it will have to do with the CPI report that comes out next month. So we're kind of all in a wait and see approach. Wish I had a crystal ball. Are there any questions so far?
No, it doesn't sound like it.
I'll keep going. So this slide just talks a little bit about how the financing process would work. For a solar lease financing such as this, we would look at a direct placement method of sale. And under this process, Oppenheimer would serve as the placement agent. And we would look to place the financing directly with an accredited investor, or in this case, a bank. Part of the process is to solicit multiple banks and investors to create a competitive process. This helps ensure, competition and getting the lowest possible rate for the city. This is slightly different than like a public bond sale. A public bond sale is kind of a more traditional, method of raising funds for city projects, but it's much more cumbersome. It includes often securing a bond rating, producing a POS or prospectus, whereas in this case, none of that is required. So it's kind of a streamlined process, has reduced cost of issuance, and definitely requires less staff time. With that being said, typically you see a maximum term of only 20 years, whereas in the public market, you may be able to secure financing, up to 30 years or slightly longer. But this is more ideal for this type of size of financing. It works pretty well typically. Are there any questions on this slide?
Michael, is there a big difference in the interest rates between the two methods that you discussed?
There can be, yes. Part of the advantage of the public market is the interest rates are serialized by maturity. So you have the advantage of a normal yield curve environment of lower interest rates in the earlier years. Right now, we kind of have an inverted yield curve, so short-term rates are kind of similar to longer-term rates. So it's not as advantageous as it typically is. But oftentimes with a small issue size like this, any interest rate benefit can be outweighed by a much larger cost of issuance, upfront cost to issue the bonds.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. And so here we just wanted to just kind of show you guys recent financing examples that we've done with this process that were specifically solar financings. We have 5 separate deals here, one of them set to close early next month. And one thing I wanted to point out here is, there's really 3 different ways to structure these financings, and what we have here are 3 different examples. So with Arvin Community Services District, this one was structured as an installment sale agreement, meaning the utility revenue was pledged to secure the financing. This next one here, Hamul Dozura Union School District, was structured as an equipment lease. In this case, the equipment itself secured the financing. And the next one here is Sperry Rec and Park District. This one was structured as a real property lease, and they used the Rec and Park's admin building and I believe a rec facility to secure the financing. So there's different ways of doing this, and we have experience with all of them. And we also have experience with different terms, right? So we have a couple of these that went out 15 years, a couple that went out 20 years. But we just wanted to show you, these are recent examples. They're relevant and they're similar to what the city is looking at doing here with this financing. And here I will turn it over to Nikki to discuss a little bit more about these financing tools.
Great, thank you. And I've turned off my video because my internet here at the conference center is a little bit sketchy. So I think that you may be able to hear me better this way. As Michael mentioned on the previous slide, the private placement is a very common way to finance these solar projects. And we gave you 5 recent examples on the slide previous. They can be structured as equipment leases, real property leases, or an installment sale agreement. Equipment lease is probably the most common structure for this type of financing. Historically, a real property lease could possibly command a lower interest rate because rather than the equipment being the subject of the lease, an admin building or a fire station could be the subject of the lease, and an investor may think that's more secure. We did canvass investors, and we'll give you on the next slide some of the feedback under these different structures. And again, an installment sale agreement is a case where the equipment is serving water or wastewater facilities, and the loan is repaid out of the water or wastewater fund only. So that's an installment sale agreement. The equipment lease, again, the most common, and the source of repayment is the general fund. The equipment is pledged as collateral to secure the financing. And the only covenant is to include the payments in the annual budget. So it's very straightforward. Here we have, let's go to the next slide, Michael. Okay, here we have some feedback. We canvassed investors. The market is continually changing. And we just got quoted interest rates. If we went out to a competitive situation, we think today we could beat it. We don't know in a week or two, but we ask for interest rates on an equipment lease, a real property lease structure, and an installment sale agreement structure. The equipment lease structure came back. We got the most aggressive quotes for interest rates. And you can see that in the column under equipment lease. The interest rate safely quoting is 4.85%. Again, if we went out today, we could probably do a little bit better than that. But just to give you an idea of the market, the 485 generates annual debt service of about $272,000. So that would be the annual payment. You can see on the top row, the par amount or the financing amount would be approximately 3.3 million. Included in that number is approximately 250,000 of capitalized interest. And capitalized interest would be the interest, in essence, pre-funded to make the first 1.5 years payment on the loan, because we would assume that the project would not be up and running for maybe 1 year or 1.5 years, so it would not be generating savings during that time. So we capitalize the interest, we pre-fund the interest so that the city makes its first payment out of its general fund after the 18-month period. We also talked to investors about a real property lease, and I was a little bit surprised about this because typically and historically, a real property lease could command a little bit lower interest rate, but the investors who prefer the real property lease and historically have been very competitive we've seen an increase in their interest rates at a faster pace over the last month than the investors who prefer an equipment lease. And we can see that here. The interest rates that we received were about a 5.05, maybe a 4.90, 5%, 5.05, 5.10. That was the range that we were quoted. That structure has a little higher cost because we need to obtain title insurance for the real property lease. So when we included that and the higher interest rate, the average fiscal year debt service was $278,000. So about $6,000 more than the equipment lease. Lastly, we talked to investors about an installment sale agreement, since a portion of the project is for the city's water system for well sites. But because we have a small piece that would be a general fund component, Public Works and Police Department, investors were not willing to bifurcate the issue and do part of it as an equipment lease and another part as an installment sale agreement. So we think when we look at the feedback that we got from investors, that an equipment lease might be the preferable way for the city to go. This is just something for your information. If the Finance Committee and ultimately the council suggests that we go forward with the project, then we would go out and get formal quotes and come back with the final interest rates. Are there any questions on this slide or the interest rates or the structure of the financing?
Doesn't look like it. No, go ahead.
Okay, no questions. Okay. Next slide. Here is a schedule of the process should the Finance Committee want to move forward after this evening's meeting. We expect that the City Council would meet on the 6th of September to approve moving forward with the tax exempt municipal lease financing of the solar project. We would go out to the investors the day after and request competitive term sheets. We would receive the term sheets on the 15th of September, and that date is important because investors will lock the interest rate for a 30-day period. So once we have the term sheets on the 15th of September, we will know what the interest rate is, and we can continue the process and the paperwork, closing the financing within 30 days so that we are not subject to interest rate fluctuation. Bond counsel would prepare the resolution and the legal documents. We would all have a chance to review and comment on those and meet the agenda deadline for the council meeting. The council meeting of the 4th, the agenda deadline would be the 27th of September. And then we would finalize documents and we could close the transaction by October 12th. So this is the process that we see. We can do it from our end and the end of the investors. We will confirm with bond counsel. I've talked to bond counsel briefly and they said the schedule sounds fine. So we don't expect that they would need more time, but this is the estimated schedule at this point. Any question on the process?
No, doesn't sound like it.
Okay. Okay. So that's our presentation on the solar financing. It certainly is not a 1% eco loan, and we recognize that, but the city does have access to the capital marketplace, and we think, you know, at what are competitive interest rates for a tax exempt financing. The market is functioning and it's available to the city if you do choose to go that direction.
Okay, thank you. You guys have anything else with the presentation?
No, that's it. If you have any questions or concerns or anything else you want to discuss, that's why I'm here to help.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's bring it back to council for our committee for a committee discussion. What are your thoughts?
What do you think, just from a council perspective, on a potential proposed timeline, does that seem accelerated, or there has to be more discussion with the entire council?
I think the timeline's fine. I do. With the real only question being, you know, staying with SiteLogic. If we stay with SiteLogic, I think that the timeline is fine. But I think that's one of the things we have to kind of discuss a little bit too, is whether or not we're comfortable with staying with SiteLogic. I'm gonna be seeking input from others on that also. But I think for me, the timeline seems reasonable, as long as staff seems like they can meet all those timelines. I mean, it is what it is. We're gonna have to pay more. If we're gonna continue with the project, we're just gonna have to pay more. So whether it's now or later, rates aren't getting better, so. But I'd like to hear from everybody else.
Well, being proposed to be an equipment and not a bond process, I think it's going to be easier for the staff to comply with all the requirements.
Doing the equipment lease, you mean?
So I'm not worried about that, work that he won't title to go through the process. Yeah.
Do you think we could,
I think it's reasonable.
the timelines?
Timeline,
What about the financing options? Is the equipment lease the option that you see as being the best?
if we're gonna stay with, currently process that we have in place, I think the rate is pretty reasonable. And we had worked with, Nikki Coleman in the past, and I feel like it will be smoothly,
They're a good group.
a process, they have a good reputation.
I think just something to add in, if we were gonna stick with the proposed timeline, staff report for that meeting would be due Friday, so. So you do September 1st to present it to council on the 6th.
Oh, you're right.
How does that line up for you?
We can compile the staff report, but it's just gonna be based on your guys' direction here today of how you guys wanna proceed, so.
Yep. What else?
Maybe I missed it. What was the actual rate, or we don't know what the rate will be, the interest rate will be?
It sounds like we don't know until we lock in on the 15th. That'll be our guarantee date, but it sounds like she believes, It'll-
Estimated 4.35.
485.
Okay.
Yeah, as an equipment lease. If it's a real property lease, it'll be just over 5.
And so the next step would be taking it to council to get approval to go
That funding.
seek the funding.
Yes.
I guess one of the other things that we could look at is if it comes out in some ridiculous number, then, you know, maybe council provides that direction as well, that if, when they're looking for that financing, and if it comes out way higher than, we look for alternatives at that point to just protect the city to, I mean, there might be a dollar amount where it no longer becomes viable, if for some reason it comes out.
Well, I think it'll come back on the 4th, where the council will have to consider the resolutions anyway, so. Nikki, you can correct me, but by taking certain action on the 6th, it doesn't necessarily lock the council into that final decision, correct?
That's correct. Action on the 6th will just really give us authority to negotiate and discuss with investors on your behalf. And then we will finalize the rate on the 15th. And you could pull it then if the rates have skyrocketed and you aren't happy with that. Again, we expect it to be a 485, could be a little bit lower. And then we would get the documentation ready, and the approval on the 27th would be for final approval of the transaction. So it will need one more approval even after September 6th.
And then, just the estimated cost of issuance, is that separate from the par amount that we'll be borrowing? Is that money that's coming from outside of what you're seeking?
The cost of issuance is included in the 3.3 million financing amount.
And you're talking about that additional 80?
Yeah.
Additional 80,000?
I also believe the capitalized interest is in there as well.
Yes.
Correct.
Like $250,000, whatever it was.
Yeah, that's something you can think about, whether or not you want to capitalize that interest or just come out of
Just come out of
pocket
pocket.
and pay an interest payment the first year. Recently, we had another customer decide to do that instead, and it saved a little bit on the annual payments.
Okay. Other thoughts on it?
I think we should go forward with the equipment lease. The delay in waiting, I think that's too risky, but if we consider going with another company, the additional staff time, I think, that we can't, quantify more staff time and resources we're putting into
starting the process all over from scratch. That would be my concern.
Okay.
Nikki, do you know what, another 25 basis points would add to the overall cost?
We can find out pretty quickly. We can run that. I don't know, Michael, if you
Yeah.
have the report
Are
up.
you talking about
If you can hang with me, maybe a couple minutes, I can pull that information for you.
Yeah. So we'll have, Michael will run it here with another 25 basis points in the interest rate. And just two points while he does that, that have come to mind while I hear your conversation. Number one, the timing from our perspective will just be important to lock the interest rate. If council needs more time for discussion, that will just push the interest rate lock back from our perspective. So we tried to put a calendar together that would be the most accelerated in order to capture the market before a possible interest rate increase by the Fed. They meet September 19th and September 20th. So your council meetings in September fell on good dates from that perspective, because we could lock the interest rate prior to the week that the Fed meets. I think, I don't know, maybe 50-50, maybe 60-40 economists think that they may increase the interest rate when they meet in September. So we'd like to come out ahead of that. But again, we don't want to, accelerate it to the council or committee's discomfort. And then the second item is with the transactions that we discussed that we've completed here over the last month and a half. When we do secure the financing, the investors like to know that the contractor is in place, this project is going forward. And so that's just something to let you know that the investors will want to know that the team is in place. It sounds like it is, but I just wanted to point that out.
And I can add that if rates were to increase by 25 basis points, so assuming an interest rate of 5.1%, the average annual debt service goes up by about $7,000. So right around $279,000 per year.
Thank you. Else?
I mean, I think it's just a decision on do we think it's going to, would another company be able to offer us the same project at, and you're really probably talking about almost $300,000 less, I would say, probably at this point, right? Because they're putting 150 on the table, and if delay and it does go up by 25 basis points, that's another 140-ish. So yeah, significantly lower, I'd say, unless we're just, from a purely, financial, what we're looking at for taxpayer dollars and utility ratepayer dollars, I think is probably a good deal if we're going to go forward with the project. And I think the project still makes sense financially over the long term.
I don't like the situation that we're in. I don't think anybody does, including SiteLogic. But I think now it's just a matter of we're either going to kill the whole project or we're going to have to move forward quickly. And that's been the unfortunate thing about this from the onset, is every single time we meet, we have these immediate deadlines. But it is what it is. That's why we're here. So from my vantage point, as frustrated as I am with SiteLogic, I think that you guys came to the table in good faith with that $150,000. So we appreciate that. Keep in mind, when this goes to council, if this committee decides to put this to council, we're gonna expect that you guys are there for that meeting.
Yes.
And, bring a mouthpiece, you're probably gonna take a little bit of a beating,
That's
on
fine,
that.
yeah, we understand.
which I think it's just gonna be working through that process. But I would say for today, my opinion is I think we need to move forward. We need to move forward with SiteLogic. We need to move forward with the financing at the, equipment lease. I think that was the most logical for both staff time, and for me, one of the deciding factors on that is, in fact, just that staff time. If we go back out to bid, yes, there's a possibility we come in less, but we only have so many people, and to go through this process again, wagering the Fed rates, it's just not a good time to make that bet with dollars that are not ours, so. But that's just my 2 cents. What else?
I feel the same way. We should move forward with these and keep SiteLogic.
Okay. So would that be,
Yeah, so staff, like I said, I think you're meeting the staff recommendation to provide direction to staff of how we want to move forward to present to council. So moving forward with SiteLogic, doing an equipment lease, presenting on the sixth.
that's just my opinion, if everybody wants that, I think we agree on that. If anybody's opposed to that or has a different idea, I would say speak now. Okay, sounds like staff has direction. Thank you.
Thank you, and if there's anything else we can do to make you more comfortable with this,
Knock off your 60
Like,
to 10.
Let me make it 200.
I'd say from
Round it up.
this point forward, just be completely transparent.
yeah,
You know, anything, for me anyway, any other hiccups that are not disclosed, are gonna kill it for me. Just from my seat up there, if there's anything else that is, well, we should have saw it coming and we didn't, is gonna start to lean me more towards like, I don't know the competencies there. So I'm just gonna be right up front about that, because this is already costing so much more money that I need complete transparency with predictions. And that means dates, that means when you guys can get equipment. I'm not really gonna have much tolerance for, we couldn't get the equipment in, we thought we could, but there's a shipment issue. All of those things we want to know ahead of time.
absolutely,
So.
yeah, communication's key.
It is.
Yeah, we'll make sure to make that happen.
Awesome, thank you.
What is the normal time for getting the equipment needed now?
For standard solar equipment, it's only been about 6 to 8 months. The transformers and PG&E work that has traditionally taken longer, and we're at the mercy of PG&E there. And as soon as we find out how long that takes.
Thank you, thanks for coming in.
All right, thank you very much.
We'll see you.
See you on the 6th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, have a good evening.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're all complete on that. We're gonna move on to item 5, sports park financing discussion. Presentation by City Manager Alex Henderson.
Yes, Chairman, members of the committee, this follows up our discussions from 2 weeks ago. If you recall, we were looking at possible next steps, whether that be polling, but one of the, just trying to get a gauge on residents' appetite for some sort of bond measure potentially, what that would look like. And so, based on that conversation, I think one of the things that we had to do some more research on is what type of questions we would be asking the public potentially. And so, we had a call with Nikki again from the Oppenheimer Group, and we were talking a little bit obviously about our most recent discussion. This item also came up as well, and so one of the things I wanted to have them put together for us was what potential borrowing scenarios might look like, what that annual debt service would be, because I think that would help guide potential future, discussions as it relates to whether or not we're talking about a sales tax measure or, we're talking about parcel taxes and things like that too, because if you recall, anything of this size will require, voter approval and how it's, for us to borrow that money. So there's a couple different ways to do it, but, I think right now I'll just, turn it over to Nikki and, Michael, and they can go through their presentation for this item, and then we can have some additional discussion. Sharing from his. Yeah, he's sharing it from his, you're on mute, Michael.
Michael, can you hear us?
Still on mute, Michael.
You're on mute.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Start all over. Yeah, can you start over for us?
Sorry about that. I didn't start. I was scrambling trying to unmute myself. I was like, what the heck? Okay. Okay, so we're gonna go over the sports complex financing presentation. Let me kind of just go through these first couple slides. We have here a market update, which I think I'll skip over since we went over that on the first presentation. And then we'll go over the financing process, go over the various financing options and types of bonds that are available to the city. And then we'll go over the good stuff, the preliminary numerical analysis that will detail how much the debt service per year might be for this type of project. Okay, so we'll skip over this slide. Preliminary steps. So as you just mentioned, due to kind of the size of this financing and the amount of funds needed to complete this type of project, this will likely require new revenue sources, which would entail approval from the voters via an election. And so here we just listed out a couple steps which you may already be aware of, but we just wanted to touch on. You'll definitely want to engage a political strategy consultant. They can help the city gauge the voters' appetite for financing this type of project. They can provide some preliminary analysis on how much this might cost in terms of taxes, et cetera, to the city's voters. They can also help craft the ballot measure, perform outreach and marketing to try to garner support for the measure. So these are all really important steps that you'd want to do prior to accessing the bond market, which you wouldn't be able to do until you get the ballot measure approved. So just wanted to touch on those few items initially. Again, for this type of financing, based on the amount we're looking at raising here, this would definitely entail a public offering method of sale. So this is slightly different than what we described for the solar lease financing. This would be a public bond sale, which would entail the underwriter purchasing the bonds and then selling them to investors in the public market. This includes putting together a preliminary official statement or prospectus that goes out to investors, which describes the terms and risks of the bonds. We would also pursue a bond rating, which is kind of a signal to the market of the creditworthiness of the issuance. This financing would also likely include getting bond insurance. Bond insurers, just as the name says, insure the bonds. This helps give an extra sense of security to investors. If for whatever reason the city was unable to make the debt service payments, the bond insurer would. So that adds to the security and helps drive down interest rates for the issuance. Another point on public offering is that it can result in lower yields. We kind of touched on this due to the serialized rates. We'll see about that one. One thing to point to touch on is this definitely includes more staff time. There's a lot more steps just going through the rating. That definitely takes a lot of time. So it's a much more involved process. But with this type of financing, it's definitely probably the recommended route. Another thing to touch on, because it's a public sale, there are ongoing continuing disclosure requirements, and that can differ based on the structure of the financing. But typically, on an annual basis, the city would be required to provide certain financial information. That could include data on the city's taxpayers, providing the city's audit in a reasonable time and basis, things like that. That would be required to be posted so that investors can access that information. A couple other things to touch on. You can definitely stretch out the amortization much further than a private placement, and this lowers the annual debt service requirements to the city. 30 years is pretty typical, and even possibly out to 35 years. Are there any questions so far? I know I kind of rattled off a bunch of points there.
No questions so far. Thank you.
Move on to the next slide. Here we just have a slide including all of the key financing team members. So like I said before, with a public sale, there are more consultants involved. We will have the underwriter, which I kind of touched on earlier. They set the pricing of the bonds and sell the bonds to investors on behalf of the city. We have a municipal advisor, which is typically recommended for a public sale. And the municipal advisor is a fiduciary to the city. Their role is to serve in the city's interest at all times, and they help work with the underwriter to structure and to structure the bonds. Also included is bond counsel. Bond counsel provides legal advice to the city. They help draft all of the legal documents and provide their tax-exempt opinion. Also included in a public bond sale is disclosure counsel, and they help prepare the official statement or prospectus for investors. You also have a trustee who is a commercial bank and administers the payments and redemptions of the bonds. And I touched on these two earlier, the rating agency and the bond insurer. Are there any questions on this slide?
No.
And here I will kick it off to Nikki, and she can kind of go over what a sample financing schedule would entail with a public sale.
Sure. And as you can see, the public offering, because of the additional due diligence, the rating, the bond insurer, it takes a little bit longer. Rather than a 6 to 8 week process with a privately placed loan, the public offering takes about 12 weeks. And that's with everybody really hustling. So it's kind of a minimum time, but it does take a little bit longer. And you can see here in the calendar how we have to layer in drafting of the preliminary official statement, which is the disclosure document, the rating presentation, and then receipt of bond insurance quotes. Then we price the bonds. Something interesting to me in this process is you see down in week 10, that's when we price the bonds. That's when we set the interest rate. So unlike a private placement, the public offering has the locking in of interest rates at the tail end of the process. With the private placement, one benefit is you can lock the interest rate earlier in the process, and it stays locked before all of the documents are approved, and can be locked for 30 days. Here, with the public offering, the interest rate is locked at the end of the process, and then closing occurs about a week and a half or 2 weeks later. So a little bit longer process because of the steps involved. Okay, we'll go to the next slide, and we're going to touch on, I think, 4 of the financing options, financing tools that are available. I think there are pros and cons. Maybe one is more of a preferred method, but let's go over them a little bit. These are the financing tools available for this type of project. A longer repayment stream, a project where the city is not generating savings from electricity cost and does not have the money to fund this project. So we're going out to vote. So the first type of bond is a general obligation bond. School districts issue these very frequently. For a city, it's a little bit less frequent because a school district has a lower threshold for the voter approval, but a city has a 2/3 voter approval for a GO bond. The repayment source is ad valorem property taxes, and the security is a pledge of that tax. And the city has to covenant to levy and collect the tax in order to make the bond payment. Here, it's structured as $1 per 100,000 of AV. So you could have 2 homeowners next to each other, and they are paying significantly different amounts for the GO bond. Maybe one homeowner has been in their home for 30 years, they have a lower assessed value, and they pay $100, for example, per 100,000 of AV, much lower than somebody who bought their home a couple years ago, has a higher AV, and their tax would be higher. This bond is used for capital improvements only. It cannot be levied for operations and maintenance. I think that's kind of a con when we're looking at the general obligation bond. The second type of bond would be a lease revenue bond. This is actually the type of bond that the city issued in 2004 to finance its fire station, and that we refinanced in 2015 to a lower interest rate. It was a lease revenue bond. It was secured by the fire station, and the city made payments from its general fund. With this large project, rather than the general fund solely being on the hook for the lease revenue bond, the city would likely pass a sales tax measure. That sales tax would come into the general fund, and the general fund would make its lease revenue bond payment, because the city wouldn't have enough money in its general fund without that sales tax to make the payment. But the repayment source is the general fund. That's on the face of it. That's what the bond offering documents will say, and then it will describe that a sales tax measure was voted in, and that sales tax, possibly among other things, will be used to make payment on the bond. With a lease revenue bond, the security and the subject of the lease would be a city-owned asset of equal or greater value. So very likely the sports park itself. The covenant is that the city will covenant in its budget to make the payment. This type of bond also can only be used for capital improvements, not for ongoing maintenance and operations. That's a negative factor in this type of bond as well. The third type of bond would actually be a sales tax revenue bond. So rather than the sales tax coming into the general fund and the general fund paying a lease revenue bond, the sales tax would be directly pledged to the bond. It's the same voter requirement, 2/3, but the city would be selling a sales tax revenue bond. The use of bond proceeds would be specified as written in the bond measure. So it could be for capital improvements and for certain operation and maintenance as well. Here, the vote on the sales tax would be much more specific than more of a general sales tax that would support a lease revenue bond. And kind of the fourth type of bond, which I think is the most flexible in this situation, is called a Community Facilities District or Special Tax Bond. So you also hear the term Mello-Roos, which has built up a negative connotation under development, but the CFD Special Tax Bond is useful and flexible in many situations, and I think a case like this, it may work well. The city would form probably a citywide community facilities district, create district boundaries of all the property that would be subject to the special tax. It requires a 2/3 voter approval, and all of the property within the district would be subject to the special tax. So it's a very flexible tax method. For example, residential property could be taxed at one rate. Commercial property could be taxed at another rate. Industrial property taxed at another rate. You have flexibility. Undeveloped property could be taxed at one rate with a trigger, if developed, to be taxed at a higher rate. So a very flexible taxing methodology. And the city would covenant to levy and collect those special taxes. They go on the property tax bill and are paid in December and April. This type of bond can be used for capital improvements and for ongoing maintenance and operations. So it's really perfect in that respect for a park, because the maintenance and operation of that sports park will be expensive going forward, especially if you have a pool or, a lot of lights, or, just to maintain the park going forward. So the tax revenue can be used for both capital and for operations and maintenance. So I think kind of from the 30,000 foot level, these are the options that the city would have to finance the project. Under all of them, it really requires a 2/3 voter approval. So that's what the political consultant or the surveyor will help you with, to see what is the preference of the constituents and what really is their taxing max. Are they willing to pay X dollars per year for this facility? And then on the next slide, we'll look at the costs. And I do want to say that we ran the numbers based on the full project fund, but in reality, and this will show you, what the payments will be. In reality, they would likely be layered in, and maybe the 45 or 60 or 75 million would not be issued on day one, but it would be voted for, and then the bonds could be issued in tranches. So with tax exempt bonds, the city has to opine that it will be willing and able to spend 85% of the proceeds within a 3-year period. So it's likely that maybe you have 3 tranches of bonds issued over 6, 7, 8-year period. But for this purpose, once the bonds are issued, for a $45 million project, the average annual debt service would be about $3,056,000. For a 60 million project, average annual debt service would be about 4 million. And for 75, for all the bells and whistles, swimming pool, everything, 75 million, the annual average debt service would be about 5 million. I'll go through the rows just to explain them a little bit. The bond reserve and the cost of issuance, you can see this is pretty high number. With a publicly offered bond, there's a requirement that a bond reserve fund be funded. And it's typically funded at the max annual debt service level. So if debt service is 3 million, then part of the bond issuance is to fund a $3 million reserve fund that sits with the trustee and is held for the term of the bonds. In the event that the agency cannot pay debt service, they tap into the reserve fund. That's an expensive component of a public offering, but in most cases a necessary one. You can see that the interest rate is a little bit lower, but that's the interest rate on the bonds. When we add the cost of issuance in the reserve fund, the all-in interest rate is somewhere in the mid-5s, about a 5.42. So I think hopefully this gives you some idea of what the debt service would be on the program to fund the entire park under 45, 60, or $75 million. I guess we see here with every 15 million of additional project fund, the average debt service goes up about $1 million a year.
Okay. Thank you.
If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, explain in any additional detail, any of the steps or points in the presentation.
Do we have any questions for her? Doesn't sound like we have any just yet,
Okay.
but as we get into it, we might.
Yep.
All right, so we'll, everything else for your presentation, bring it back to committee.
I have nothing else for my Nikki, I do have one question. When you talk about the different types of borrowing options, for the Land Secure Community Facilities District, I've heard that can be challenged potentially if there's not a nexus for benefit for what the borrowing's for. So, you know, if you don't live close to the facility, or, you know, for example, you don't have you can claim you don't have kids, or whatever the argument is that basically then you can challenge that you shouldn't be subject to the tax. Does that sound familiar?
Well, it does. I think when you do a community facility district, a special tax, you'll hire a consultant who will write what's called a rate and method of apportionment. And that rate and method will give legal basis for the amount of tax that is paid by each parcel, whether it's residential, commercial, industrial, whether it's next door to the sports park, or whether it's across the highway, whether a resident has children or not. But typically, and in general, the improvements that are allowed under, it's called the Mello-Roos Act, and that's the act that sets up the CFD. And the improvements that are legally allowed under the Mello-Roos Act include, quote, general benefit projects, libraries, schools, sports parks, recreational facilities. And so if it's a use that's allowed, and the RMA is written and legally adopted, it's it's hard, in my opinion, for somebody to come and say, well, we don't have kids who are playing baseball, so we shouldn't have to pay for the baseball park because it's a general benefit to the community and is expected to increase the value and, the value of homes in the area who have the benefit of that park being nearby. We see more legal challenge with land secured assessment districts where there has to be a special benefit to a parcel. So you cannot finance a library or a sports park with those types of bonds. So we see more legal challenges there. But with the CFD, while they may aggravate some of the constituents and they may not like it, typically if the RMA is written correctly and it's an improvement that's allowed under the Mello-Roos Act, it'll be allowable.
Okay.
And there will be a period, for public comment. There'll be a period for appeals. It has to have, I think it's a 60-day challenge window. So there's a process that will kind of, allow for comment from the public, and the attorneys who work on the bonds, as well as the city attorney, will have time to weigh in on the comments.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Do we have any more questions for her? Yet? Not yet? So let's talk about what we want to do here. How about we start with the financing? Alma, how does this look for you? Just be blunt about it.
I'm overwhelmed by the figures.
Okay.
And, we can, try it, but, yeah, I'm just overwhelmed.
Yeah.
It will make an impact in the city, in the staff. But if we want to proceed, if that's the desire, it has to be from the financial tools that, by looking at, it will have to be recommended sales tax revenue bond or the CFD. Not a lease revenue bond, in my opinion, because we'll be limited for no maintenance and operation and paid out of the general fund.
And that maintenance and operation, Daniel, you can speak, is going to be pretty substantial.
Uh-huh.
Huge, not just the maintenance, but the staff to run it. The day-to-day operations piece is gonna be huge there besides the maintenance piece.
Mhm.
The initial infrastructure of building, I'm pretty sure we're gonna have to underground that canal, do road improvements in there as well too. I mean, it's just gonna be substantial, so having a funding mechanism that contributes to a portion of that cost is gonna be important.
But you're gonna have to hire new staff, buy new equipment.
Trucks, Genie bills, I mean, ideally, we'd like to also have solar out there, but I mean, that's, that's a conversation for another day as well too, but I mean, it's just depending on how heavy that gets used, with the village center, I mean, it's just a lot of staff that we're gonna have to bring on board, so.
Councilmember Smith?
It seems the only logical way would be the sales tax bond or the CFD because of the O&M costs. But I'm not real wild about the sales tax, given that we will be on the highest, one of the highest in, the county. And I think that'll have a large, I think that could negatively impact, our downtown. So I would not like to see going that route. So I do think if we're going to move forward with this, what makes sense to me would be the CFD.
Assistant City Manager, what's your take on it?
I don't know how much you would have to make the CFD tax in order to actually fund even the cheapest option here. It seems cost prohibitive, but maybe I'm missing information or just cheap and think it seems like there's not enough, like that we would have to tax way too much in order to make even the 45 project work. But do we actually know how much approximately we would need to tax per property? I mean, it sounds like it's based on the assessed value, and so that could be different for every single property. So is there even a realistic way to determine what those numbers look like annually?
I think it all depends. If you have a $200,000 house versus a $1.2 million house,
Right.
you're talking about, it's not gonna be cheap for anyone.
Do we have estimates on the assessed values? So
Well,
that we can-
let me just clarify. Michael, can you go to that slide with the 4 options across the top? Right, the general obligation bond on the left is the bond that is a certain dollar amount per assessed value. With the CFD on the far right, that tax per parcel can be set really at any level, and it can be set different for residential, different for commercial, different for industrial. So there's a wide flexibility with how it's set. It can be set on acreage of a parcel. It can be set on development. It can be, very flexible. So with the CFD, it is not based on assessed value, but it can be crafted. But we don't know sitting here today what that amount could be. The polling may tell you an average residential parcel might be willing to pay, I don't know, $400 a year for this project. Commercial parcel may be willing to pay X dollars, $5,000 a year or something. And that would tell you and you could calculate what you could afford on an annual basis going forward for the sports park.
Thank you.
That makes sense.
for clarifying.
So our existing CFDs that we have right now, which are basically all for new development, right? So homeowners pay the same amount. So if you're in a subdivision, it doesn't matter how whatever improvements you put in, whatever, same amount, you pay the same as your neighbors. Commercials by the square foot, so it's a certain amount per square foot. So if we wanted to do that, then we'd have to engage like DTA or somebody like that, and they would do an analysis of like, okay, at this level, this is what this level per home based upon what our existing, houses are, this amount per, this is what you get from commercial versus from our existing commercial, so we can do that. No, I don't know what that number is right now.
No matter what, those numbers still need to come to $3, $4, or $5 million a year.
Right,
Or you have to redesign this.
right.
I think the village center is it's pretty expensive. So I think that's like 100,000 square feet of total. If you're $175 a square foot, $17.5 million. So you can take that out. Place it with a pool, might be the same amount though. So, you know what I mean? So that's another question. It's just like, okay, at 45 million, you know, so like the sales tax, it doesn't sound like we're talking about sales tax, right? But our 1% sales tax pushes about I think it was about 2.7. So even if you went down to a $30 million project and went that, if you decided to go that route, then you could have like, that'd be like a $2 million debt service, and then you'd have the remaining amount would be for, potentially for O&M or something, right? But you have the same, and then you gotta figure out how that plays with Measure E and stuff that we've talked about too. So it just kind of, you know, now I think part of this is, like I said, we can see what the total amount is, because if you look at the total debt service, it's still double, I mean, basically, right? Like if you're borrowing 30 million, you're gonna pay 60 million over the life of the debt service. So yeah, it just becomes, you know, more questions and, okay, now that we have this information, do we want to pare back or do some sort of phased approach or not move forward with anything?
So I think no matter how we slice it, we can't afford it. It's just beyond our means. And it's hard to say because I think that there is a perception by the public that this is an approved project, because of a very generous donor being willing to work with us on that. But I gotta tell you, looking at these numbers, no matter which one of these we choose, it just exposes us to too much liability in other areas that I'm not comfortable with. I'm not comfortable with it potentially impacting Measure E. I'm not comfortable with assessing people that much money on property tax. I just think that all of those things are gonna come back, and especially these that end up being obligations of our general funds in the future. I don't see it as being a viable option. It's a great project, it's awesome, but we just can't afford it. And all of these options are us basically trying to get a payday advance on something that we don't need. We have needs in the city, we have wants, and then we have dreams. And I think this is very much falling into the dreams category. Just for me, from my standpoint, I'm not comfortable with it in any capacity, and just being respectful of staff time in the future. I think from a financial standpoint, it's best for us to just table the entire project for right now. And I know that that's gonna be hard for some people, but the reality is I don't see a scenario in which we can afford it. And I don't wanna put a bunch more staff time into a project that, even if we tear it down and make it less appealing to the public, we still can't afford it. So it's gonna be a hard conversation with, especially us that are elected, to explain this to people, but it's just too big of a lift. And I think that at the finance committee level, one of our jobs is to look at financial viability of these projects, and I don't see it. I see it being an ongoing cost of hundreds of thousands of extra dollars a year that we don't have. It's not gonna make money. And, you know, if something changes in the future where we have large private funding, grants come available, things like that, we can reassess it. But I would say, for the time being, I'm really not even comfortable spending money on going out and polling. If we can't afford it, what's the point in asking people if they want it? I feel like it's like going to your kids and saying, hey, do you guys want a new car? But we can't make the house payment. It doesn't make sense to even spend that. I think we can use that $70,000 elsewhere. But again, it's just one opinion. So I'm not even comfortable with taking it to council. I think that we can table it at this level because we all know we can't afford it. We all want it. There's lots of options here, but we just can't afford it. So I don't even know that it needs to go to council if it's not financially viable.
I agree.
Thank you. Well,
I mean, that's what I meant and said, he said it more eloquently and directly than I did.
and it's unfortunate because I think we all want to find a way. And I think that staff has done a great job trying to find every possible angle to make it happen. I mean, all these different bond measures, they've talked about tearing it down. I know there's been a lot of public and private conversations about this. And I just think that if we've had enough very intelligent people working on this project that if there was a reasonable option, we would have it in front of us, and I just don't see it. I don't see any option that's even remotely reasonable for the amount of money that we have.
When you say don't take it to council, that's fine. Do you want us to report something out just because of the project itself, or just have separate conversations with the council members about what the finance, well, ultimately whatever the finance committee decides, but,
I would say my recommendation would be I will report it out for committee reports.
Okay.
And if there is an appetite for council to have further discussion about it publicly, we can. But I don't know that it needs to be an agendized item where we're bringing everybody from the public
sure,
in to comment on it. If we can't afford it, we can't afford it.
sure.
So,
It's just, yeah, I agree. It's just been a long talked about topic, so I just want to make sure that's the end of it.
it has, and I would say that it's looking like it's closure for now. But it's not like it's closure forever. If things change in the future, we can always revisit it at a financing level, but until we know whether or not we can afford it, until something significant changes financially, I don't know that it's an option.
Like even in terms of grants, like the recent Prop 68 grants, one that we got for the dog park, like the biggest grant that you could get there was $5 million, and it's a small.
That's
even though
that's
$5
1
million
year's
is a lot of
payment.
money, it's still a small amount compared to what we need for, you know, a project of this size, so.
Yeah, I think we can do a lot of good in the town for that amount of money. So, I think that's just a recommendation from staff, correct? Direction? Is there anything else on the sports park discussion? Okay, we'll move on to item 6, other business. Does anyone have any other business?
No?
You seem exhausted. Okay, we will move on to item 7. We will adjourn this regular meeting.
I was sweating.